Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online adolescent psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in social transitions. Now, like in lecture 2, or chapter 2 I should say, we have properly set up the microphone settings. So luckily I do not sound like I'm streaming out of a tin can. Deadpan to me, just verifying that these things are indeed correct so I don't look like a fool. We are verified, and with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with social redefinition. This is defined as the process through which an individual's position or status is redefined by society. In all societies, adolescence is a period of social transition. The individual comes to be recognized as an adult. The specific elements of this social passage from childhood into adulthood vary across place and time. So throughout adolescence, across all cultures, and across all of time, we see that as individuals age and increase that kind of adolescent period, society begins to redefine who that person is, going from more of a childlike figure to more of an adult-like figure. Now, the specific kind of ceremonies and or I should just say the forms of that kind of transition, that redefinition by society, changes across cultures and across historical eras. So let's look at some components of social development wherein society tells us that this is no longer a child, but something a little different, approaching adulthood. Beginning with identity. Attaining adult status contributes to adolescents feeling more mature and thinking more seriously about future work and family roles. Autonomy. Adult status leads to shifts in responsibility, independence, and freedom. The adolescent turned adult faces a wider range of decisions that have serious long-term consequences. How often should I drink? Should I drink and drive? So kind of the identity part, you can see that even how society and cultures and just macro kind of systems impact and a quote-unquote individual's identity, wherein as you kind of age, you take on more adult-like roles, as stated, family roles, maybe start working a little bit, and those roles kind of give you a new perspective on kind of life, how you define yourself, because in those roles, family, again, like labor-oriented and like a wage-related job, they require certain responsibilities. So there's more expected of you, and in order to act in that role, you kind of have to act a little differently. You know, you don't get to act like you're in a 11th grade classroom or whatever. If you're thinking back to like a 6th grade classroom, you don't get to act like that anymore. You're now working at the hot new Dairy Queen, and there's expectations on you. You have to deal with those beautiful customers that come to ask for a Blizzard. But kind of the big takeaway here is that process, that context that you are placed in, adheres new responsibilities and kind of a obligation to maturity that contributes to differences in behaviors and, again, kind of a shaping of your identity. And you can see this across kind of all social roles. Like, I'm not who I am as, you know, or I'm not the same person who I always am, like on this lecture. I have a role, or I have an idea of like, oh, this is a role, a duty of a professor, so therefore I should kind of act in this kind of specific way. Then we can kind of have this autonomy, which kind of, again, all these kind of concepts, like everything in psychology bleeds, they all tie together a little bit. But whereas before it was a more identity-based, I am a worker, I am a caregiver in this household, I'm an important member of my family, contributing in various ways. Here, this kind of really focusing on the autonomy. That is, that new independence and that new responsibility creates opportunities for decision points in your life. So whatever, do I decide to work a double today? Do I decide to study or not today? Do I decide to get like high? Are we getting drunk? Are we getting crossfaded tonight? What's going on? Should I drink and drive? All these kind of things are much more consequential now because you kind of have a lot more on the line, and you're kind of more treated as an adult by society. Thus, you aren't kind of able to get away with the same kind of shit you were as a child. And then, not only that, but obviously, like, the consequences are far bigger. So literally drinking and driving is kind of a life or death decision, which obviously can exist at like 6, 7 years old, but not to the same extent and not as frequent as kind of this adult decision making. So other kind of social components of that social redefinition of adulthood, achievement. Adolescents must attain a certain age before becoming a full-time employee or leaving school on their own volition. Laws limit how much a minor can work. Relationships. Young person faces new decisions about intimacy, dating, children, and marriage. Age of majority. This is designated age at which an individual is recognized as an adult. Age you can marry without a parental consent, not universal. Statutory rape. Sex between two individuals, even when it's consensual, when at least one of the persons is below the legal age of consent. United States, the specific age of consent varies from state to state. Sexually active adolescent teens who may not be adults yet, abortion and contraception autonomy. All right, so kind of working our way through this here, beginning with achievement. And we're really looking at here kind of a combination of like achievement as like being alive and even kind of like degrees, for example, like educational degrees. So we understand that there's limits on how much a minor can work. So like a 10-year-old can't work a 40-hour per week per job. They also cannot drop out of school. So kind of that increase with age, you're able to drop out of school if you want. You're able to work more hours. And also kind of as you achieve a high school diploma, bachelor's degree, associate's degree, whatever, etc., you're able to kind of unlock, that achievement allows you kind of to unlock kind of new opportunities. Then we have this relationships. Relationships become more complex. You're now adolescents begin to date. They can have children because they've had puberty. There are teen moms that exist, obviously. And in some states, depending on the state, they can get married even before the age of 18, I believe. I believe there's about 12 states, actually. And probably the different states have kind of requirements on paternal sign-off on it, permission on it. But still, kind of the idea here is that as you enter more complex social relationships, you have kind of, again, new social possibilities, ranging from marriage, dating, children, intimacy, friendship, all those beautiful things. The designated age, so then we have the age of majority. So here, once you get to this age, then you're able to marry without having parental permission, for example. But so this is kind of just a demarcation in a given country. It's age of like adulthood, quote unquote adulthood. So 18 here, for example. 18, you unlock all kinds of new rights and abilities and opportunities that did not exist when you were 13, for example. And then we have these statutory rape laws, wherein basically, depending on the age of the two people involved in the sexual act, it may be illegal. So just making up something, say someone's 18 and they're one of the people in the relationship is 18 years of age, and the other person in the relationship is 17. They have theoretically consensual sex, and then but however, statutory rape laws may actually state that that is in fact illegal. So even though it's consensual, one of those people is an adult, the 18-year-old, and the 17-year-old, however, is not an adult. Now, in most states, there's kind of like an age range because it gets kind of a little dicey because you're literally like outlawing like a junior and a senior from dating, or maybe a senior in high school and like a freshman in college, which is not that uncommon. So kind of different laws kind of have different ranges in how they define statutory rape. But in the most extreme example, for example, like a 40-year-old and a 16-year-old, that would be statutory rape because theoretically they cannot consent, even though they are consenting, they can't consent as adults. Is kind of the argument. Now, kind of then, but then the question becomes, okay, well, that may be true, but should adolescents be able to consent to abortion and contraception? And then, so then you got that debate, which again, it can vary by state and also kind of historical era, because like, frankly, like contraception, abortion, these are like women's rights issues. And then, 100 years ago, well, one, the birth control measures weren't as effective as today and as common in circulation. It was also like social stigma attached to it. So kind of those kind of gender roles, gender expectations, all also kind of playing impact on the laws and the customs of a given culture across time. Now let's talk about something called the elongation of adolescence. Adolescents last longer today than ever before. Individuals start puberty earlier and enter an adult roles of work and family later. Experts define adolescence as, quote, beginning in biology and ending in culture. Although a 12-year-old may be capable of giving birth to a child, we would not label them as, quote, adults. We use social indicators defined through cultures to define adulthood. Menarche and marriage are probably the best indicators to use for the beginning and end of adolescence. In the middle of the 19th century, that is the 1800s, adolescence lasted around 5 years. By 1900, it lasted about 7 years. By 2010, 15 years passed between menarche and marriage on average. Okay, so we see here that adolescence, even this basic definition of this, is rooted in kind of the historical era you live in, rooted in culture. So like that's what this beginning in biology, ending in culture is kind of arguing. That is, it begins with puberty and then ends with some kind of idea of marriage, maybe graduation from college, maybe independent living. And again, you can see those three examples right there are going to have massive historical variation, wherein, 100 years ago, most people did not attend college. The super majority of people didn't. It was a institution for the white rich elite. It was overwhelmingly what academia, higher ed was for, versus now, much more variation in those student populations. And even something like living alone, those due to high rents, maybe you graduate during a recession, you graduate during COVID, depression, those kind of things can impact your kind of financial resources, and thus kind of put you, make you more likely to live at home longer, may make you more likely to delay marriage. So thus, those are so that kind of that end of adolescence is kind of culturally and historically defined versus kind of like that more biologically based. But even then, as we talked about before, even biology, the beginning of puberty is impacted by the environment. The historical area you live in, the stressors you experience, all these kind of different things. And thus, looking at the 1800s, you can see that adolescence only lasted 5 years. So from the age of menarche to marriage. One reason for that is because lifespan is much shorter. So it's like, oh damn, I'm gonna die at 40. Well, it's time to start a family right now. Like, let's go. I'm already like in my the middle of my life at 20 years old, just again, broadly kind of speaking, versus, like later on today when the life expectancy, depending on the measure, or upper 70s, lower 80s. So those things are going to change. And thus, like in 2010, the age between menarche and marriage being 15 years, aka more than double that from 200 years ago. So again, this is just a great example of the kind of the impact of culture and historical era on kind of these definitions, these constructs, in this case, adolescent. And in fact, kind of building on that, some scholars argue that adolescence is mainly a social invention. Interventionists, they are theorists who argue that the period of adolescence is mainly a social invention. Adolescence is defined primarily by the ways in which society does or does not recognize the period as distinct from childhood or adulthood. For example, we draw the line on when someone is out of elementary school, when someone can vote, which is an indicator of whether you are an adult. Adolescence is defined differently in different cultures and historical periods. Problems experienced during adolescence may be due to society's definition of adolescence, not cognitive or biological changes. This challenges G. Stanley Hall's view that psychological changes of adolescence are driven by puberty. So basically what they're arguing here, or the interventionists are arguing, is that adolescence is a social construct. That is, and evidence for this is that the ways we recognize a child moving towards adulthood are socially defined. So for example, again here, we have a marker at what age you graduate elementary school, what age you graduate middle school, what age you graduate high school. And that age of high school, consequently, dovetails right into 18 years old, right when you're an adult. We have a marker of when you're allowed to vote at 18 years old. And again, these things are historically specific. They did not always have, even elementary school, middle school, high school. Most people did not attend like high school like 100 years ago. This is like not a thing. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. Same thing with like voting. This is a purely chosen law that we've created in this country. Different countries have different laws of when you can vote. So like some countries allow voting at like 16 years of age. Thus, more adulthood at 16 years of age. So kind of all those kind of examples of the fact that, or all that evidence that adulthood is socially defined by society suggests that adulthood or adolescence and adulthood by kind of extension is at least partially socially defined, right? And a social invention slash commonly referred to as a social construct, and thus kind of challenging the kind of this old school view that's really not really supported anymore of this dude named Hall, this psychologist who's like, oh, adolescence is just turmoil, chaos, and not only that, puberty is kind of defining this, and they're like, no, actually it's not. Puberty could be like contributing to maybe some emotional volatility, but really it's this larger structure. Again, those macro chronos structures, putting people in specific environments, aka schooling, that didn't exist 100, 200 years ago, putting adolescents in those specific environments. Thus, they're going to be subject to kind of unique, historically unique, I should say, kind of developmental context, which historically didn't exist, aka they're going to be in school for 12 years at least, which was not the case 200 years ago. Thus, all this kind of peer-to-peer interaction is very much society-based. It did not exist, 200 years ago in the US. Some arguments for the invention of adolescence include the impact of industrialization, or I should say some kind of areas of focus for these kind of theorists. They argue that adolescence did not exist until industrialization. In the 16th to 17th century, children were treated as mini adults. Everyone described below 18 and 21 were quote-unquote children. The term adolescent was not widely used before industrialization. The primary way to demarcate adulthood was property ownership. Industrialization broke the connection between what individuals learned in childhood and what they would need to know as adults. Adulthood was much more certain. You did what your community parents did prior to industrialization. Parents encouraged younger children to stay in school longer after industrialization, however. This new social setting generated a peer group in youth culture. Staying in school lessened job competition between adolescents and adults. Child protectionists, they argue that individuals who argued early in the 20th century that adolescents needed to be kept out of the labor force to protect them from hazards in the workplace. Massive labor rights campaign humanized U.S. child labor laws. Okay, so let's go through this a little bit. So kind of the impact of industrialization. So when industrialization occurred, basically a ton of people left like rural farming and went to the city. There was a massive social upheaval. This is a huge, massive event in the world. And with that came kind of new expectations, new understandings of childhood, of adolescence, of adulthood. And it was so new that, as stated, that the term adolescence really was not used at all prior to industrialization. Thus, kind of again indicating that this kind of social historical impact, in this case here, an economic factor, kind of influenced, trickled its way down. So that's kind of like the structure, industrialization, kind of structuring or kind of like acting as a structure from which kind of behaviors and like the analysis or kind of interactions with adolescent peers developed out of. So basically, again, kind of more hopefully clearly stated, industrializations forced adolescents to attend school longer, which created opportunities to be influenced by their peers, and thus kind of their peers in schooling to heavily influence their developmental outcomes. So again, that did not exist. That kind of peer network did not exist at the same level prior to industrialization. And in fact, prior to industrialization, there really wasn't a lot of like confusion about what you do after becoming an adult or as you work your way towards adulthood. You're just going to do whatever it is that your family did, what your community did. They're farmers, we grow beets, or whatever. They always grew beets. I'm always going to grow beets. It's kind of a historical legacy you really didn't have to think about. It's kind of thus kind of less uncertainty. But as industrialization occurred, kind of new specialization, new skills were needed to operate kind of this heavy machinery. Thus, children kind of were encouraged to stay in school longer to kind of develop these skills. And kind of the presence of staying in school longer created literally a culture within a school setting, which did not really exist prior to that. But not only that, kind of pushing students kind of out of labor, out of like wage jobs and into schools allowed for adults who now had to compete for these factory-oriented jobs, kind of less competition. So you're basically taking the children out of the labor pool and thus allowing decreasing the level of competition between workers. At the same time, kind of these child protectionists kind of give a rosy view, I should say, on kind of one of the reasons why children were kind of kicked out of the workforce and taken into school. So basically they're arguing like, yes, all these social things did happen, but also let's also consider that we were being very, very nice. And we wanted the children to go to attend school and get out of the labor force because we really, really cared about the children. It's a little debated, as I talk about in different classes, that early 1900s and late 1800s, a very contentious relationship between labor and capital, wherein there was tons of child sweatshops, and it took a very kind of, frankly, militant and kind of many protests, many actions beyond protesting to kind of force to remove child labor laws from the books. Now, there actually is still some, but far less than before. So again, that kind of impact of child labor laws, industrialization, contributing to children attending school, thus developing a culture, thus adolescence is now formed because we need these kids to stay in school, develop these skills, and eventually take up these industrial jobs. In the late 19th century, adolescence came to be viewed as a lengthy time of preparation for adulthood. This view started in the middle class and spread. One reason it spread was because the society moved away from an agrarian economy, aka like farming. Educational requirements became higher. Teenager, a term popularized about 50 years ago to refer to young people, influenced by increased individualism, indisposable income, a new consumer group. Some saw this as a good thing. You have more money, others saw it as moral decline. Youth. Today, a term used to refer to individuals ranging from 18 to 22 years of age. It once referred to individual aged between 12 and 24 years old. Similar to something called emerging adulthood. In some ways you feel like an adult, in others you don't. So again, we kind of have this industrialization. We have people leaving their farms, abandoning an agrarian economy, transitioning towards an industrial economy, which requires more education. Thus, you're going to stay in school longer, especially not just the rich here, but the kind of upper middle class were kind of the first people to work their way up towards that kind of goal, or to kind of make that kind of migration. Because they had more resources. They were able to kind of allow their children to kind of attend school versus kind of, oh, I have to work on the farm. One reason why you had a lot of kids on the farm is like, hey, I need like farm hands or we're going to all starve to death. Like we need kind of this labor from our children and kind of as a collective. But as you know, you go up the wealth ladder, you go up the class ladder, you gotta have more resources and thus can be ahead of the curve and kind of educating this future cohort of a quote-unquote middle class. Now, this kind of teenager point is a kind of, again, an interesting point. You know, 50 years ago, basically, all of a sudden, this term teenager exists. Again, you can see these are very, very recent phenomenons. And this is going on around the same time as increased individualization. So a lot of people call like the US like an individualistic culture. Well, it's important to keep in mind that individualism, that rate of individualism fluctuates through history. And basically the last 120, 140 years, that individualism has gone up and up and up and up. So it's not like your culture is static through time. Culture is always moving. So, you know, just because in this case, like the US, oh, we're super individualistic at this current moment, it doesn't mean that it's like optimal like culture that's producing the greatest developmental outcomes. It's just in this specific historical era, a certain level of individualism exists, which can have negatives and or positive developmental outcomes, depending on kind of like your ideological belief. But kind of at the same time, as that individualism is increasing, all of a sudden disposable income is increasing as well. Teenagers now, this new kind of what we eventually call teenagers, those adolescents, start to have more disposable income. Households in the United States are having more disposable income. And thus, what does that mean? You now have new markets, new people you can target to sell stuff to. Thus, you're going to create all kinds of new advertising campaigns that creates what we know as the teenager, super like cool, trendy. They're going out, they're being cool. Back then, you're smoking cigarettes. Today, you're vaping. It's all you're living the dream. Nothing can stop you. You're a rebel without a cause. All of this is heavily influenced by marketing. And really, this is actually around this time, actually marketing advertisement really like begins to emerge. Like, again, that's not something that exists throughout all time. If you want to look up kind of Freud's brother, Sigmund Freud's brother was heavily involved with creating advertising during this time. But anyway, so we have kind of this increase of individualization, increase of disposable income, and frankly, a level of disposable income that's never going to like exist again. It was a hyper like profitable time for the U.S., because for a whole host of like historical reasons, and thus kind of you creating the new suburbs, the boomers all come out of this increase, this massive amount of wealth. And anyway, all this comes together, and now you have this new teenager. Again, evidence of a social construct. And really the final bullet point is just that youth, even though we kind of have some demarcated lines, it can be confusing at times, right? Because at 18, well, you can't drink alcohol, but you can go like die in some war or something along those lines. You could smoke. You can't really rent a car though. So kind of in some ways you're like an adult, some ways you feel like an adult, some ways you don't. And that's kind of because there's really not just like one indicator of adulthood, but all kinds of massive ones, which are massively influenced by kind of social circumstances. Which brings us to this term, emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is a term for ages 18 to 25, caught between adolescence and adulthood. And there are even kind of debates and differences on kind of this age range. Spoiler, it's increasing. Emerging adults are characterized by 5 main features: the exploration of possible identities before making enduring choices, instability in work, romantic relationships, and living arrangements, a focus on oneself and independent functioning, a feeling of being caught between adolescence and adulthood, in the sense that life holds many possibilities. And kind of the point here, and we're gonna expand on this momentarily, is are these kind of feature of kind of development universal? Is this universal, or is this emerging adulthood universal across all cultures? And look at some of these here. You have kind of an exploration of possible identities, really individually oriented, caught between adolescence and adulthood. You could be these possibilities of the future. You could be anything. There's instabilities of all these things moving around you. But also, it's kind of like, well, and able to perform all that exploration, spend 7 years in college, get a master's degree, and not really get a ton of income in the meantime. Well, not everybody has those social resources, those financial resources, to be able to kind of fully partake in kind of this exploration of the self during adolescence, or I should say during emerging adulthood. Thus, kind of the question is this kind of universal? How much of this is universal? How much of this is kind of historically rooted? Again, kind of this thinking about the many possibilities in life really wasn't a thing like 500 years ago. You're mostly going to just be confined to your typical neighborhood unless you get on a boat somewhere and that's one reason why people explored. They're like, well, I need to get the hell out of this city. I'm never going to go anywhere, so let's jump on this boat. And even though there's probably like an 80% chance I'm going to die of some rat's going to bite me, I'm going to die. Got to go for it. So kind of breaking down the universality of emerging adulthood, it has a class component, as I stated. How much can you afford to experiment / figure out what you want to do with your life? Emerging adulthood does not exist in all cultures. Several recent analyses indicate that there is a great variability among people in their mid-20s in the nature of emerging adulthood. A minority of the world population can afford to give an emerging adult a decade to experiment. US, Canada, Australia, Japan, higher wealth Western European countries. The existence of emerging adulthood may have a lot to do with values and priorities, not just the economy. Emerging adults want to take time before assuming full adult responsibilities. So kind of this is what I was alluding to before. In order to kind of like screw around and be like, okay, what do I want to do? I'm going to change my major for the 19th time. It's not that big of a deal. Like, whatever. Emerging adulthood, it'll go to 30. I don't begin adulthood until I'm 30 years old. Well, that's not always going to be universal for self-evident reasons. You can't afford, literally, as a population, to do so in many contexts. And even in the West, really, or the global North is what it's kind of referred to now, you see differences even there. So with different kind of like social welfare systems, like whatever, Canada having like national health care plan, or health insurance plan, I should say. Those things kind of can impact you. Like, say you're disabled, a disabled emerging adult. Do you have time to mess around with that? Well, maybe if I have like a higher social safety net, maybe. So again, those kind of economic factors, those country environmental factors influence the likelihood of engaging in this emerging adulthood. Psychological well-being in emerging adulthood. Relatively little research has examined psychological development and functioning during emerging adulthood. It can be a difficult time of floundering in financial instability. It can also be a time of carefree independence. It's been found that there are significant rates of mental illness and suicide during emerging adulthood. In a given year, 1/5, about 20% of this age range, suffer from a mental illness. Young adult suicide rates are twice as high compared to teenagers. Young adults in unsupportive environments who face discrimination and are poor are more at risk. It is possible that economic forces have delayed the transition to social adulthood without changing the transition into psychological adulthood. So breaking this down briefly, you can see kind of the much higher rates of suicide risk among emerging adults, which really kind of begs the question, hey, maybe we should be putting more resources, to the extent we put more resources towards anything, more resources towards emerging adults than kind of the younger teenagers. They appear to be more at risk than these kind of younger teenagers. And kind of the idea here is that, well, what we talked about throughout this course, and we'll continue to talk about throughout this course, the emerging adults most at risk are those in poor environments, wherein they have a whole host of stressors that exist by growing up in poverty. Emerging adults who face discrimination. So whatever, you're a trans emerging adult growing up in a city that has anti-trans laws. Not going to be great for you. Or just a racial minority, for example. Disabled person, whatever. Name your favorite oppressed group. These kind of things put people more at risk of negative developmental outcomes, such as suicide risk, in unsupportive environments, which can range from your immediate family, to your school, to your neighborhood, to, again, the state, the country that you live in. And then the final bullet point really is just kind of a debate of, is emerging adulthood a kind of a unique phase of development wherein you change kind of psychologically, or is it something else? Like this, again, this is kind of socially based a little bit, but so kind of trying to demarcate is there differences between an emerging adult who goes straight to full-time job versus an emerging adult who goes to college and does well, or maybe goes to college and does a little, not as well, but eventually gets there. It's a little delayed, but eventually reaches kind of graduation. So kind of like, are there kind of psychological developmental differences between kind of those three groups? Is it a stage of development? And in social adulthood is basically just social roles. So starting a job, becoming a parent, becoming a husband, wife, whatever. Like, we understand that economic forces have definitely changed that. Like marriage, all these kind of things have all been pushed later and later due to kind of, well, one reason, not just exclusively, but definitely strongly influenced by kind of economic circumstances. Hey guys, spoiler, rent is expensive. And having a job is expensive, all these kind of things. Whatever, it's kind of the higher likelihood of having a higher paid job for having a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, all these things kind of delay kind of taking on social roles that are traditionally associated with adulthood. A study of emerging adults was conducted, and the study looked at different groups of American youths from 18 to mid-20s, again, emerging adulthood. The study compared four groups, or I should say the authors compared four groups. Those who reported positive well-being across the entire interval of emerging adulthood. Those who reported negative well-being across the entire interval of emerging adulthood. Those who started low, that is, they had a low well-being, but their well-being increased throughout emerging adulthood. And those who started high, that is, again, they began with very high, relatively high psychological well-being, but their well-being decreased throughout emerging adulthood. So basically four groups: those who started positive and then ended positive, those who started negative, ended negative, those who started negative but increased in positivity, and those who started positive but decreased in well-being throughout the time that this study was conducted. And what this study found, or the authors found, again I should say, is that 80% of the sample, that is 80% of the emerging adults sampled in this study, showed stability over the interval. Psychological functioning in childhood and adolescence predict later life success. Success in one stage, such as doing well in high school, leads to success in the next stage, such as getting into a good college. Money and good parents / family / community are consistent predictors of well-being. 7% of emerging adults saw a decline in their well-being throughout emerging adulthood, while 10% who started low ended up high in well-being among the emerging adults. Experiences in work, romance, operating in social environments were linked to well-being changes. Conclusions. Debatable if emerging adulthood is a quote-unquote stage, but psychological transitions do take place. Is a 23-year-old who undergoes this elongated development different from a 23-year-old who starts working immediately? There may be that their emerging adulthood is a psychological stage, but that macroeconomic forces delay transition into social adulthood, the roles people occupy in society, or the roles, I should say. So our first big finding is that this 80% number showed stability over the interval. That is, if you started high on well-being, you're you're far more likely to end emerging adulthood with high well-being. If you started emerging adulthood with low well-being, you're at greater risk of completing emerging adulthood with lower levels of well-being. So you start strong, you finish strong. You start low, you finish low. That is the most likely outcome. And this is consistent with what we understand throughout development. Again, development, you don't exist in a vacuum. What you were before a particular age is influenced by what you were before that, I should say. So what you are at a particular age is influenced by what you were before that. These things predict each other. Now, that doesn't mean you're locked into stone, but one reason why people are kind of this stability emerges is because you're going to still probably be in the same kind of neighborhood, have the same relatives, the same family issues, same social issues, same discrimination. Your environment probably hasn't radically changed on average for most people in this like 5 to 7 year period. You're still being hit with the same kind of social circumstances. You still exist in the same world. Thus, you're probably you're highly likely to encounter the same stressors and kind of protective factors. Thus, again, the people who start off strong are far more likely to finish strong, and those who start low are far more likely to be at risk of having low well-being at the end of emerging adulthood. But as you stated, 7% saw a decline during emerging adulthood in their well-being, while 10% saw an increase in well-being. And they found that, spoiler, your experiences in romance, at work, all your social environments influence and act as predictors of your psychological well-being, which again, kind of straightforward. If you have a very solid, stable relationship, more likely to have positive outcomes versus a very rocky, tumultuous, kind of quote-unquote toxic relationship kind of thing, more likely to be at risk. Same thing kind of jobs, whatever. You're working a hard job, you're grinding, it's demoralizing, it's mundane tasks, you feel like you're caught in a dead-end job, nothing is going, like you have no future, you're just like, damn, I'm working the same kind of thing every single day. It's the SpongeBob little like video where that fish is like standing in traffic or driving to work every day, stuck in traffic, then just come home at the end of the day and screams. Like you're caught in a mundane, meaningless labor. But on the other hand, being involved in meaningful labor, being more predictive of positive kind of developmental outcomes. So basically, some of our conclusions is that, yes, kind of big changes do emerge during emerging adulthood. However, kind of questions still remain on kind of the differences between 23-year-olds who who start working immediately versus a 23-year-old who maybe goes to grad school or takes a longer track. And again, these also may be defined by the cultural moment, the economic period that you're in, yeah, most likely, probably. Changes in status during adolescence. Adolescents experience a two-sided change in status. Both increase privileges and increase expectations for responsibility. Drawing a legal boundary, we draw different boundaries for different social purposes. Voting, buying alcohol, driving. Initiation ceremony. the formal induction of a young person into adulthood. Adult status allows people allows individuals to participate in particular activities such as gambling, buying alcohol, and seeing X-rated films. Status offense: a violation of the law that pertains to minors but not adults. An adult can leave school or home without official penalties. Juvenile justice system: a separate system of courts and related institutions developed to handle juvenile crime and delinquency. Criminal justice system: the system of courts and related institutions developed to handle adult crime. So kind of as stated, adolescents begin as they approach adulthood, all of a sudden have new privileges, but also new expectations in areas of responsibility, wherein they're able to buy alcohol, for example, they're able to vote, they're able to drive. However, you can see here that as I kind of stated a little earlier, that these kind of demarcations, these legal boundaries are socially defined, and thus they can be different. So whatever, depending on the state you live in, you can drive at 15 years old with a parent or 16 years old alone, but you have to be 21 to buy alcohol. You can vote at 18, but again, as I said, in different countries, you can vote at 16. So kind of different privileges unlock at different ages and different expectations, theoretically voting or whatever, or not drinking and driving. But again, those kind of privileges and expectations can vary by cultures. Then we have the ceremony situation wherein usually marked by some kind of ceremony. So high school graduation, for example, depending on the religious ceremonies that you undergo to be an adult, in the eyes of your religion, or kind of their specific cultural ones as well. But also we kind of have a completely different, theoretically completely different, not exactly, criminal justice systems for minors and adults, wherein minors are not charged to the same extent that adults are, because the kind of thought process is, oh, this person's 13, they don't fully understand / they can't fully kind of regulate their behavior to the same extent a 40-year-old can. Thus, different expectations are put on them. They also have less privileges, so we're like, okay, we give them less privileges to act, therefore, if we're going to give them less privileges, it kind of makes sense to kind of give less penalties. It's not like we are telling 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds that they can do whatever they want, just like an adult, but at the same time only be punished like a child. No, we're giving them privileges, theoretically, appropriate for their age, while theoretically giving them some kind of punishment appropriate for their age. Again, very debatable depending on your ideology, but that's the rationale. Some debates include about, for adolescent criminality, should juveniles who commit crimes be viewed as less blameworthy than adults? If a young person has committed a violent crime, should they be treated as a child, or processed as a delinquent, or tried as an adult and processed as a criminal? Should young teenagers and adults who are convicted of the same crime receive the same penalties? In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court raised the age at which individuals can be sentenced to the death penalty from 16 years of age to 18 years of age. Are adolescents competent to stand trial and make other legal decisions? One study found about a third of children 13 or younger were unable to serve as competent defendants. They are less likely than adults to understand their rights, more likely to confess, less likely to understand long-term consequences of plea deals. So kind of a breakthrough here, we kind of seeing what I talked about before, is kind of culpability related to privileges and duties in society, and specifically for these adolescents. And here looking at the Supreme Court case, again, you can see historical errors matter, wherein prior to 2004, if you committed some kind of murder, or, depending on the exact charge, someone's dead, you are at risk of being given the death penalty, which is obviously end game for a developmental outcome, versus in 2005, not as much. So kind of this, again, demonstrates that social expectations, these rules, are socially defined. Thus, kind of the people theoretically have an opportunity to kind of change these laws and our understandings of kind of adulthood and adolescence. Now, kind of one study kind of illustrating the differences in adolescent and not in really just early teenage children and adults looked at kind of their ability to serve as competent witness. And surprisingly, shocker, if you're under 13 years old, you have a high likelihood of being of not having any idea what the hell you're doing, trying to defend yourself. Again, demonstrating that they don't literally have like the capabilities to kind of undergo a complex court case. Shocking. And not only that, they're more likely to confess crimes they shouldn't confess to, not understand their rights, take deals that they didn't mean to take. And you see this throughout time, wherein and this, again, laws on this change. A lot of, it still happens, but to even a larger extent, 40, 50 years ago, you just get a young child alone in the room, an adolescent in the room, typically, spoiler, a racial minority, and say, did you commit this crime? And then there's like pressure on them, like social pressure, and then they confess to a fake crime, or they take a plea deal and they're like, oh, I get to go home now, that's the end of this, and then boom, they're in prison for like decades. So like, this is a constant kind of issue throughout history. Quinceañera, well said, an elaborate sort of, quote, coming out celebration for adolescent girls that is practiced in many Latino communities. On college campuses, sororities and fraternities conduct group initiations. Timetable is affected by economics, politics, and culture. So kind of the idea here is that these transitions, this social redefinition process often occurs in groups. So we have this thing called cohorts effects. So depending on what historical era you live in, you're basically exposed to different environmental factors, have different environmental constraints, and kind of share more culturally similar rituals. So, for example, like a cohort effect could be having the internet. Now we have the internet, but 100 years ago, they didn't have the internet. So if right now, apparently, if you're like 90 years old right now, most of your life has existed outside the internet. That's not the case if you were born in like 2000. You probably spent most of your life on the internet. But at the same time, you also have differences in access to resources. We all kind of know the standard, like people over 60 years old kind of having like, again, like most of the wealth in this country being very concentrated in that cohort, again, kind of rooted in historical era of like just that mass profit that existed like in that like 1950s, 1960s range. But then we also have this kind of strong bond thing where it's rituals. So maybe like a pep rally at a high school or some kind of like just well, you can say like high school graduation or something along those lines that kind of bring your little group kind of together. You also have differences across different cultural contexts. So we have the quince here with the kind of a classic celebration of adolescent girls kind of entering kind of adulthood / that emerging adulthood, more adult-like, I should say, period. And then we also have kind of group initiations at like sororities, fraternities, wherein going through some type of hardship or classically like hazing kind of builds kind of a strong camaraderie between the people who participated in that ritual together. And again, this kind of timetable, these specific rituals are all influenced by like massive macro level kind of features of development. Real or symbolic separation from parents. In some societies, young people are expected to sleep in households other than their own. Examples from contemporary society include summer camps, boarding schools, and colleges. In earlier centuries, common for adolescents to leave home and live with other families in the community to learn occupational skills or work as domestic servants. An emphasis on differences between sexes, stress of physical and social differences between males and females, cultural differences. Education is far less common for girls than boys in rural, underdeveloped settings. In earlier centuries in the US, males and females were separated in different educational institutions, different classrooms, or exclusion completely. So we know as children age, they go to school, and thus they're spending more time away from their parents, but also there's these other things like summer camps, go off to nerd camp, go do some science, something along those lines, where you live away for a month or two, and your parents get some rest away from you. Boarding school is a classic kind of like UK thing for whatever reason, just like sending children off to boarding schools. They had some questionable parenting practices, but granted, I don't know, maybe it was expected, so it was fine. Who knows? But it is very classic UK. And then more kind of historically, you can imagine kind of like a community wherein they have a good relations with maybe a neighboring community. So thus they kind of have different skills, and they would have family members go to a neighboring community, live with them for a little bit, acquire some skills, and or act as a domestic servant to make some money or goods, and then bring it back to your original community. There's also differences in sex, wherein kind of historically, women more likely to be excluded from educational opportunities across kind of the world, and in the U.S., obviously, where young female adolescent girls, I was kind of thinking through, they're not adults, they're not teenagers. I'm like rotating all these terms in my head. Anyway, school-aged children who are males and females were separated by sex, especially kind of early on in earlier centuries, and so either separated completely from each other or basically just excluded. So those can kind of have differences in kind of the levels of separation, because the boys may be more likely to be at school, thus more physically separated from the parent, thus more like independent-minded. Boys should be doing, exploring themselves, their manhood, all those kind of things, could be partially kind of rooted in that structural kind of exclusion. But obviously there will be multiple reasons. Other common practices include passing on information from the older generation. This information concerns several different categories. Matters thought to be important to adults, but of limited use to children. Matters thought to be necessary for adults, but unfit for children. Matters concerning the history or rituals of the family or community. In both traditional and contemporary societies, adolescence is a time of instruction and preparation for adulthood. In sub-indigenous cultures, children are sent to a type of school where they are taught productive activities important to the communities, such as hunting, fishing, and farming. During adolescence, children are taught about sexual relationships, morality, and societal lore. Many societies have body rituals that are not used until adolescence. Scarification, the intentional creation of scars on some parts of the body, often done as part of an initiation ceremony. These can include tattoos, shaving, piercings, makeup, and earlobe punctures. So kind of throughout development, we kind of hit a period where it's like, okay, well, I got to teach the next generation some things. And then we have kind of these three broad categories, but there's others. But so for example, matters thought to be important to adults, but of limited use to children. So maybe something dealing with their specific work, or something that doesn't immediately apply to the child, but it's not really morally taboo. But the adult thinks it's important for the child, or maybe just fun to know. So if you ever go like on TikTok and see those videos of asking, really, I think they might be Gen Alpha right now, like really young kids, like 5th, 7th grade. Spoiler, everyone, you're not the youngest generation. There's a generation younger than you. Anyway, and asking them like, oh, what does these things mean? And then they just don't know any of them. Like, what is dial-up internet? What is blah, blah, blah? And they just ask questions that obviously like a 10-year-old wouldn't know. But the adult, they experience that. That's part of their upbringing. It's the joys of their childhood, thus kind of trying to pass it on to their child kind of thing. Even though you probably are never going to have to use dial-up internet. Folks, if you don't know what dial-up internet is, simply Google it. Basically, it was the slowest thing of all time. If you downloaded a movie, say you were going to pirate a movie in the day, it would take over a week to download it versus like, I don't know, 30 minutes a day. That's how slow it was. It was insane. Also, to get online, you had to like use your landline, your house phones, and which would then, thus, if you're online, you can't receive any calls. This is this whole thing. Anyway, matters thought to be necessary for adults but unfit for children. So this would be something like a sex ed or something like that. So something necessary for children or for adults, but for children, hey, we don't want our 12-year-olds just running around having like unprotected sex, something along those lines. And then history of rituals of the family or community. So any kind of thing that runs in the family and or community. So you see kind of throughout cultures, all kinds of cultures having these, like indigenous communities or whatever, having various ceremonies that are connected to like multiple generations, going back multiple generations that are meaningful to that like tight-knit community. And in both in contemporary and traditional cultures, the adolescence is used as a period wherein they're kind of taught things that are supposed to be useful to the future. So kind of indigenous communities, much more direct, like, hey, we're a hunting community, we're a fishing community, we're a farming community. you need to learn those right now because you're going to be an adult soon. More versus kind of more industrialized, non-indigenous communities, preparing for adulthood, maybe through like additional schooling, like gen ed classes, like through an elongated college period. But again, kind of both societies, understanding that adolescence is an emerging adulthood is like a time wherein important education occurs. And there are markers of this physically, wherein some tattoos in some cultures, shavings, piercings, for example, makeup allowed to be used in more frequency, and then earlobe punctures, such as like the Maasai in Kenya, for example. Kind of a little bit rooted in kind of attraction, so kind of working your way towards like sexual maturity, while at the same time physical markings of kind of adulthood. We're often, like especially in kind of more traditional societies, more, so you'll see in like subsistence societies, that is like moneyless societies centered around like hunter, gathering, or farming. Completely different visualizations of adult and child, wherein they have, again, kind of specific tattoos, markings, makeups, piercing, that indicate that, hey, you are different. You are an adult and you have, again, new responsibilities and new roles that you have to partake in this like collective. There's variations in transitions. Societies differ in the process of social redefinition on two important dimensions: clarity, that is the explicitness of transitions, and continuity, the smoothness of transitions. Beginning with clarity, in the US, there are few or no nationwide official formal ceremonies marking the transition from adulthood to adolescence, or to from adolescence to adulthood, excuse me. More community universal ones are found in communities that share a religion that unites their community and structures their daily lives. Most people in their late teens and their 20s say they are adults in some ways and not in others. There is no clear indication of when responsibilities and privileges as an adult begins in the modern United States. So kind of as stated here, in the US, there isn't a single wide, like, global ceremony wherein, woo, you have reached full adulthood. Because even at 18, again, you're not able to fully do everything. You can't run a car, you can't drink alcohol, just a couple common ones. So it's not, so thus kind of there's some uncertainty. It's not super clear when one becomes an adult. Plus you again have that emerging adulthood, a kind of confusion period that now exists. Thus, typically in their people in their late teens and early 20s, and throughout their 20s, frankly, say, listen, I kind of feel like an adult in some ways. I feel like an adult today. Don't really feel like an adult now. And this is because of this kind of non-clarity and kind of this elongation of emerging adulthood. Because there are no official macro, clear transitions, adolescents' views of themselves are instructive. Studies of how people define adulthood in contemporary society indicate three interesting trends. There is less emphasis on attaining a specific role and more emphasis on self-reliance. There has been a striking decline in the importance of marriage and parenthood as defining features of adulthood. And now there are similar criteria for males and females and fewer gender-type role expectations. So kind of the idea here is because in the US, there's really not a single marker of a single macro marker of adulthood, you can, it's probably more beneficial and it is useful to ask adolescents their views on what emerging adulthood and what adulthood means to them. And what they have found, again, is that kind of a less emphasis on a specific role, which, again, kind of makes sense because emerging adulthood, you're working your way through your 20s trying to figure out who you want to be, what you want to be when you grow up, what job, what career you want to have. So kind of less emphasis on hammering it down exactly what I want to do, but more emphasis on like, hey, I'm self-reliant, I can do myself, and kind of figure out things in my own way through time. Alongside, less emphasis on parenthood and marriage. You don't have to have a child to be considered an adult. Again, kind of a historical marker, a redefinition kind of adulthood, wherein parent rates have declined and kind of rates of marriage have been pushed back, or the average age of marriage has been pushed back across, by multiple years from early 1900s to 2022. And we kind of have differences now in gender roles, wherein they are becoming more egalitarian, wherein similar criteria are more expected for males and females across adulthood than 100 years ago, wherein, for obvious reasons, again, excluded from the workforce, women excluded from the workforce, excluded from universities traditionally, all these kind of things. While at the same time, oh wait, there's not these super profits that also existed in the 1950s. That doesn't work anymore. There's not a single income earner. We need two incomes. Thus, kind of pushed by kind of these macroeconomic features. Oh wait, we need also women to work, or we're going to not be able to afford a house. Thus, kind of you can see kind of the impact of those macro features even on like household gender roles, alongside obviously kind of like struggles for removing kind of sexist kind of barriers to women throughout society. Some which has worked to some degrees, and in other ways, well, there you see kind of declines. So again, always kind of in flux. However, in most traditional cultures, social redefinition is clearly recognized. It's typically the passage into adulthood is marked by a formal initiation ceremony, when transitions into adult work, family, and citizenship occur close in time, and when most family members transition around the same time, there is greater clarity. For example, say you have to get married at 18, have to work in X area for Y amount of years. So kind of the beginning, kind of this point here is that in kind of traditional cultures, traditional societies, there's much clearer kind of demarcations of when you're an adult. And thus kind of people are all kind of going through the same developmental transitions around the same time. Boom, you're married at 18. Boom, you have a kid at 18 or 19. Boom, you work here for X amount of years. You have Y job, Y responsibilities. These are all much more confined historically, but not so much today. For boys, timing of ceremony varies. It can be puberty, at a designated chronological age, or when community decides the individual is ready for status change. For girls, timing is usually linked to onset of menstruation. Physical appearance is often changed, clothing, scarification. Adults are clearly differentiated from children, I should say, and you would not see teenagers dressing like adults or adults dressing like teenagers. So we have some slight kind of differences here, with boys a little less clear, as we've talked about before, and we all have this kind of physical appearance kind of idea, wherein young, like a 6-year-old is not going to be expected to dress like a 46-year-old. And then we also have this scarification, where we talked about different cultures having different tattoos, scars that allow for kind of visual representation, a physical representation of kind of adulthood. And these are all, again, much more clearly marked in traditional societies. The baby boom generation is often used as a point of comparison for young people, deeply embedded in our cultural understanding of family, adolescence, and adulthood. Baby boom, the period during World War II, following World War II, I should say, during which the number of infants born was extremely large. Finishing school, moving out, and getting married all happened earlier than today and within a narrower time frame. In 1960, the average age of marriage for women was 20, and the average age for marriage for men was 22. In 2020, that number was 28 years old for women and 30 years old for men. In 1960, fewer than 30% of 18 to 29-year-olds lived with their parents. However, in 2020, that number increased to 50%, and that number likely increased during COVID. In 1960, most adolescents went immediately into full-time employment after graduating high school. Today, about 70% attend college. So this is kind of a common issue in kind of developmental psychology, especially like in the early years, or even pretty relatively recently. I would say even early 2000s. Where in baby boom generation is just used as a reference point for all aspects of humanity. That is oh, the baby boomers went through XYZ. This is their developmental trajectory. Therefore, this is kind of the standard universal way of development. This is how the family units should be. This is how all developmental trajectories should be. All these things. So thus kind of using them as a point of reference. But again, it's much, I think, I would argue, more accurate to imagine a baby boomer generation as really a specific, almost outlier generation, wherein the US coming out of World War II has massive, massive super profits. So kind of just some background information. All of Europe is basically destroyed. The Soviet Union, very poor, very rural, still has to undergo massive industrialization. What would become the third world / the global south, still very, very poor, coming out of colonial, direct colonization. And what's left? US, with insane amount of wealth in the world, a number that had never existed. The US share of the world wealth has never been replicated. That amount of wealth they had after World War II allowed for just basically a ton of money for this baby boom generation. That basically most likely will never be replicated ever again. So rather than this being like this historical like reference points, it really is kind of like an outlier. But regardless, that kind of period is, the white picket fence and like the family unit and all these kind of things is kind of thought as quote unquote the American family. And you can see this in just some kind of markers of this, differences between the average age of marriage, the likelihood of living with your parents. Obviously, that's going to be impacted by income, and your decision after graduating, going to high school versus going to college. So baby boomers much more likely to go to high school versus going to college, versus now more likely to go to college than beginning full-time employment for obvious economic reasons. Again, very, very much historically rooted, kind of like out of that World War II super profit U.S. like just dominance and of wealth. Like you should look it up. It's very interesting how much wealth the U.S. had during this period. However, if you look in the early 19th century, that is the early 1800s, in some ways, adolescence was just as disorderly and prolonged as it is today. Many people moved back and forth between arenas where they were viewed differently. In school, they were viewed as children. At work, they were viewed as adults. The timetable for the assumption of adult roles depended on the household or family needs. Rather than nationally accepted schooling and work standards, it could be working in another community, but called back to take care of something at home. Time spent at home before leaving was higher in the early 20th century than the 1960s, a number of political, economic, and cultural reasons. So basically what this is getting at here is that the early 1800s did see kind of actually a lot of fluctuation during this adolescent period, wherein, so for example, if you were at home, you're like, okay, well, I have particular needs or kind of roles to fulfill within the household, versus maybe I'm working and then a week later I have to go to a neighboring village, and now I'm an employee, and now I'm a worker rather than like a child at home. So I have two competing roles, and those roles like fluctuate depending on kind of where I am. I can be called back home, for example, and then I'm a kid again. And you can also see time spent at home was much larger in the 1900s versus the 1960s. So again, 1960s, that baby boomer generation, kind of arguably a massive outlier that cannot be replicated ever again. And thus kind of like that classic understanding of, okay, development is, and you used to see this, again, definitely going back like 20 years or so, where you'd say, okay, yeah, young people start off with X political ideology, but as they age, they become Y political ideology. And this is just, again, just rooted basically on just like the baby boomer like generation developmental outcomes. Now, again, I should say though, when doing generational analysis, it's a little hacky at times because there's mass variability. Like for example, black American baby boomers, little difference and slash a lot of difference in kind of the struggles that they had to go through in kind of the access to material wealth, etc. So yes, there's mass variation, so you don't want to overdo it, those kind of things, but more instead kind of think about it as you grew up in a particular historical era, there are certain norms, certain expectations, certain resources available to you, more likely to have those resources available to you than in a different era is probably the cleanest way without getting into like over reductionist like generational comparison, which can be just absurd at times. Moving on to variations in continuity, how continuous social redefinition is varies depending on the culture and the historical era. Continuous transitions, passages into adulthood in which adult roles and statuses are entered into gradually. For example, if a child grew up working on a family farm and is going to continue this as an adult, they are characterized as a continuous transition. Discontinuous transition, passages into adulthood in which adult roles and statuses are entered into abruptly. For example, a child with no work experience enters the workforce for the first time after college are characterized as discontinuous. So kind of traditionally, as stated before, you grew up as a farmer, you're more likely to be a farmer. You've kind of grown up your whole life kind of on that trajectory, like a slope towards being an adult farmer. Versus discontinuous, you can kind of think of this as like disjointed, wherein you have one role, like student for example, wherein you're more or less like not working at all. Maybe a little bit, but traditionally kind of like not a lot. And then all of a sudden, boom, you graduate. Oh, wait, now I'm an adult and I have to perform all these adult roles. That is a marked kind of big shift versus, again, kind of that gradual shift up. Transition into to adulthood in the modern U.S. is discontinuous. This is marked by sudden, abrupt shifts, often with little training. Adolescents are given little preparation for the three important roles of worker, parent, and citizen. Adolescents are typically segregated from these types of activities. Jobs available to teenagers are not like those they will hold most likely as adults. Most young people have little training in child rearing and related matters. This is a historical artifact. Children are closer in age today. Adolescents are segregated from most of society's political institutions. There is little participation in government/the community roles before being told to go rock the vote. People are required to assume those roles when they reach the age of majority, that is, adult status. So the U.S., modern U.S., is a discontinuous kind of a form of societal emergence into adulthood. And you can see kind of examples here as worker, parent, and citizens. So for worker, most of the jobs that adolescents work in are not jobs they're going to work in as adults, in generally speaking. Thus, kind of, they're receiving very little training. But all of a sudden, they graduate and boom, it's time to enter the job market. You're on LinkedIn, you need 700 years of experience, you need specific skills, and you're expected to navigate that process. You also have little training with children. So kind of historically, children, because people had more children, because frankly they died far more often, that you would have children much more often. So you'd have a kid who's like 20 years old, a kid who's 2 years old. And thus, kind of like that range of children in your household allowed the older children to kind of take care of their peers. This is much less common today with fewer children in the household in the U.S. and the children in the U.S. being much closer in age. Adolescents are segregated from most parts of the society, so kind of stated, it's pretty obvious here that prior to 18 years old, you ain't voting. So all of a sudden at 18, you vote after basically not participating in voting at all your whole life, or having basically most likely zero direct contact with like government voting or any kind of like political stuff like that. Or even like community roles. All of a sudden you turn 18 and boom, you're supposed to theoretically participate in some kind of community role, important community role, whereas before you just weren't doing anything. So you go from like nothing to boom, everything all at once, thus kind of disjointed and discontinuous. And this could be challenging, obviously, and maybe obviously one source of stress for emerging adults in the United States. In most traditional cultures, transition to adulthood is continuous. Adolescence preparation for adulthood comes from observation and hands-on community. When work takes adults out of the local community, children often accompany them to work. They become involved in hands-on work tasks that have meaningful connections to the work they will perform as adults. Informal, but highly contextual. Vygotsky's ring a bell. Modernization and globalization are making the contemporary, more discontinuous transition more common around the world. Quote-unquote common psych struggles include developing an identity, choosing occupation, worrying about getting into a great college are becoming more common. As formal education becomes more required, parents are less able to provide children advice on how to prepare for adulthood. So kind of traditionally, as stated here, a parent would bring their child to work with them because their child is probably going to work in a similar job. So thus, boom, you get a little hands-on training, and you're integrating not just really skill set, but you're also integrating the child into that social context, learning the norms, kind of understanding the social expectations of that labor context, just becoming comfortable, being integrated into that community, your next gen. And thus you're working on, you're performing hands-on work, developing skills, but also arguably even more important for labor is you're developing meaningful connections to your work. Your job becomes part of a kind of intergenerational kind of thing, wherein you're gaining meaning, social meaning, family-related meaning, community meaning within your job. Now, you can obviously still get that today, but it's a far more difficult process and not as direct hands-on. So kind of, so as kind of this modernization, industrialization, quote-unquote globalization increases, that this is creating higher levels of discontinuous transitions. Thus, some kind of common psych problems associated with this is struggling with identity, worrying about occupations, choosing an occupation, worrying about colleges, because again, you have quote unquote, woo, I have so much freedom of choice. Yeah, but you're also kind of like on your own and you need to kind of figure it out abruptly and quickly on your own. So, oh, woo, you got all this freedom, but also like you're just like rolling 900 miles per hour down a hill with very little guidance. And obviously, different households can have different levels of guidance, different resources. If you're first generation students, way less guidance, lower income, racial minority, disabled, less opportunity. All these kind of things influence these common site problems. And not only that, but as more formal education required, well, your parents probably didn't have that level of formal education, so they can't really help you to the same extent that these traditional kind of continuous transitions, those parents in those situations can. Your parents literally did not experience it. And they also literally didn't grow up in kind of this economy, especially with like older parents. Again, a completely different economic context, which makes things more challenging for kind of like direct intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Especially if you have kind of like weird beliefs that are like not correct. Such as like the baby boomer generation developmental trajectory, again, broadly stated, is like this universal experience that you are somehow not meeting. During earlier periods in American history, the transition into adult roles began at a younger age and proceeded along a more continuous path. Many adolescents learned to work on the family farm or by accompanying their father. Many others left home early to work as apprentices or servants in neighboring communities. The average U.S. American and European left school around before 15 years of age. They lived semi-independently under adult supervision from age 12 to 22 or beyond. Living with large families better prepared young people for family life, put in more child-rearing roles. By the end of the 20th century, this was largely gone. So this is kind of rooted in industrialization. All of a sudden, you can imagine for them, oh wait, I'm in kind of like this very kind of small community, maybe rural, some kind of industry, but not a lot. But all of a sudden, boom, huge factories. We got to go, urbanization happens, all these things are going on. And all of a sudden, a big shift, and you have to just basically wipe out the way you were transitioning into adulthood before. So instead of going that continuous development, now you have more of an abrupt, discontinuous development, less opportunity to, again, kind of work kind of under an umbrella of a family or a community unit, raise children within your community, within your family. That is now gone. Now, boom, you're more likely to be on your own, and that trend just kept going up and up and up. Some current trends include, in many industrialized countries, individuals are living with their parents for longer periods of time. This probably is caused by increased costs of housing and transportation. In 2014, first time in over a century, U.S. Americans between 18 and 34 years of age were living with parents than any other living arrangement. So they were living among the possible living arrangements. The most common was living with parents. This excludes independent living with financial support young adults. In U.S., about half of young adults who live at home report it has not affected their relationship with parents. However, 25% state it improved it. Again, revealed why it's critical to understand macro context, such as the economy, when trying to figure out what quote-unquote normal adolescence is. Macro-level historical events change these societal defined constructs. Rise in drug and alcohol use is much less among young adults living at home than among most students who leave home for college. So as I stated, in 2014, for the first time in over 100 years, the plurality of U.S. Americans who were between 18 and 34 years of age were living at home with their parents. Plus, what that second half of that bullet point is saying is, if you include people who live quote-unquote independently but are supported by their parents, that number is even larger, aka the total amount of 18 and 34-year-olds either being having their bills paid for but living quote-unquote independently or living at their house, at their parents' house, is the plurality of 18 and 34-year-olds. So now these people are basically somewhere around the age of, 42 on the upper end. So really kind of you're getting that, the age demarcator is usually around 35 to 40, around 40 years old probably now because they're a little older, of the people who they get clumped in. They're the ones who are excluded kind of from that big bump. That's when you really start that economic decline. The 40-year-olds really never got to live in that elite economy where it's like super profits. Now, the supermajority of people living with their parents reported that it did not affect their relationships with their parents. But again, this was in 2012. Has that changed since 2016? Definitely has. So how big that number is now, not sure. But again, this is kind of historical fact. You can see there, macro politics impacting relationships. There you go. But ultimately, the big point here is that these big markers of transition into adulthood are society-based. They are what is a norm depends on the historical era. So here, again, rent's high, gas prices are high, food's high, jobs pay less. Basically, the real wages of employees have basically been stagnant, has not increased since like the 1980s in real wages, adjusting for inflation. Basically, workers' salaries have not increased again in like 40 years. These things matter. Thus, you're more likely to stay home if you can, save that money, live in different arrangements. These things, thus, what the norm is shifts through time. Commentators have argued there are three very different transitions from adolescence into adulthood. One transition for the haves, one for the have-nots, and one for those who are somewhere in between. This is because types of passages depend on the researchers available to a person, or resources available to a person, and shifts in larger macro historical trends, such as housing prices. This happens between countries, but also within countries. Two societal trends are reshaping the nature of transitions. The increasing length of the transitional period, early average puberty, later average marriage, and increasing demand for more formal education means you have to spend more time as economically dependent students delay adult family roles. As success in the labor force becomes more dependent on education, the gap between the quote haves and have-nots will grow, absent some type of public interventions. So basically what these researchers are arguing is that, listen, emerging adulthood, adolescence, development, there's different tracks of different pathways of development depending on what class you're in. They're talking about class. Psychologists are wary of talking about class for various reasons. And what they're saying here is haves, which is AKA like the upper class, have-nots, referring to property owning people, non-wealthy people, AKA like poor people. Versus somewhere in between, they're getting at something called like maybe middle class or something along those lines. But basically, they're just saying here that due to the resources available to a person in one of those three groups, you're going to have kind of different developmental trajectories. Wherein the lower class you are, the more risk you are for negative developmental outcomes. But at the same time, not just those kind of three groups, or depending on your political ideology, two groups, like wealthy, non-wealthy, or whatever. Again, this all depends. This is a specific theory. Other shifts happen in the macro historical trends. We all talked about housing prices. So the impact of housing prices is going to impact, in this scenario, the have-nots or those in between more than the haves, because just straightforward, there's more resources are required to quote-unquote be independent and quote-unquote be an adult. Therefore, what it means to be adult will be different depending on if you're in the haves, the have-nots, or somewhere in between, or something, or different categories depending on your political ideology. But this also happens between countries. So, for example, the haves and have-nots are not created equally across the world. Like if you're like rural Congo, what it means to be a have-not means that you're living under like $1 per day. So thus, like, you can have differences between countries, but in which, can have whole historical reasons for the Congo colonialism, or maybe the rise and fall of an empire. The British Empire fell, which prior to that, hey, they were a lot more wealthy, like relatively speaking to the rest of the world. And then we just move to these two societal trends. We have increasing or an earlier age of puberty and later average age of marriage, thus a very long period of adolescence or emerging adulthood. At the same time, increasing demands for education requires you to stay in school longer. Thus, you're able to work less, and thus you're more economically dependent for a longer period of time. And as the labor force becomes more competitive, the jobs, unless something changes, which, I mean, anything, it's possible that we are humans, but if nothing changes, the gap between haves and have-nots, aka wealthy and not wealthy, are going to continue to expand, not just in the US, but across the world. Thus, there will be kind of more finite resources. Thus, you need more education to get access to, or even have the chance to have a stable living environment. Therefore, even more demands on people to stay in education longer and longer and longer. And this trend will keep going until there is some kind of macro or historical change. Youngsters from some ethnic minority groups, such as Black, Latino, Native Americans, have more difficulty making the transition to adulthood. Factors include poverty, discrimination, disproportionate involvement in the justice system, and segregation. At the beginning of the century, 2/3 of U.S. American adolescents were white. Today, half of U.S. American adolescents are from ethnic minority groups. By the end of the century, it is estimated that nearly 2/3 of U.S. American adolescents will be from ethnic minority groups. So, kind of straightforward here, for some reasons why poor and racial minorities or disenfranchised groups often have more transition, or have difficulties in transitioning into adulthood. Just massive discrimination, poverty, which again is associated with countless stressors, over-involvement in the justice system, aka far more likely to be arrested, and once you're kind of in that pipeline, you're more likely to be arrested again, less likely to have kind of a stable, well-paying job, all kinds of risks. And then like housing discrimination or redlining, all these things, all putting people of lower class and racial minorities and disabled people all at greater risk. U.S. adolescents who are born in other countries are achieving better than expected performance in school and in mental health. They generally fare better than adolescents from the same ethnic group who are U.S. born. Quote unquote, the Americanization is associated with worse outcomes compared with immigrants who acted less like typical Americans of the same age. Could shift as community acceptance is a predictor of immigrants' adolescent well-being. A 2012 study or 2020 study found immigrants are more likely to be bullied than non-immigrants. Elevated risk in communities where there are higher levels of anti-immigrant attitudes. So that first kind of two main bullet points is a classic interesting study in psychology, wherein immigrants of a group perform better than children of American, U.S. American children of that same group. So whatever, you're Pakistani, but you're born in the U.S. versus Pakistani, and you're born in Pakistan and you immigrate here at 13 years old, you're more likely to achieve higher performance in school if you're that Pakistani 13-year-old. And you can see this a bunch of different cultures, such as like Latinos, for example, very, very common, which is basically telling us that something in the U.S., something culturally, something structurally is kind of driving the disparities in outcomes in those groups, and that something is socializing them or whatever, negatively impacting them in some way to be at greater risk of negative developmental outcomes. Now, the final bullet point just basically says that there are still kind of pitfalls if you're an immigrant. So, for example, you immigrate to a city that hates immigrants or hates your specific subtype or your specific ethnic group, you're going to be at greater risk of being bullied and worse developmental outcomes for kind of self-evident reasons. Which brings us to the epidemiological paradox, which is defined as, or explained as, Latinos experience good health across a variety of conditions, including disadvantaged conditions in the U.S. One prominent explanation supported by data is that Hispanic Americans engage in healthier behaviors than do white Americans. For example, drinking and smoking less. They benefit from much more social support from large communities and are highly value raising families. Unusually high levels of positive affect is a cultural norm, with cultural scripts such as simpatico. There are possible explanations for why Latinos have such healthy outcomes, but much of this epidemiological paradox remains unresolved. Paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans, for example, do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans. So kind of like the classic understanding here is that white U.S. Americans are more likely to have the best health outcomes for a whole host of historical reasons. But interestingly, in some groups of Latinos, they actually have more positive developmental outcomes than white Americans. And there's a whole host of theoretical reasons why, such as kind of a strong collective, strong community, more involved in kind of like family ties. But interestingly, though, it's not found in all groups, and the longer that kind of group, the Latino Americans, are in the U.S., the more that paradox declines, aka that protective factor, whatever those protective factors are, decrease in kind of their strength And thus, Latinos over time kind of see a dip in kind of their developmental outcomes, which is again telling us something about American culture, structure, economics, something is going on here. And also interestingly, this is not found in Puerto Ricans, which again is interesting because it's telling us something. Why might Puerto Rican developmental outcomes not have this kind of increased health compared to other Latinos? One, maybe because they're basically a colony, as we've seen numerous times. And guess what? This video will be shown a year from now, and there will also be another Puerto Rico disaster wherein their electricity goes out. They're underinvested. All the roots of like colonialism and non-control of their life kind of stemming up again. If you don't know, for people who don't know, Puerto Ricans cannot, their votes are not counted towards the presidential election. So even though they vote, the vote is basically meaningless. It's symbolic. They have very little control over kind of their economics right now, and they're constantly hit by natural disasters that the mainland U.S. kind of like really doesn't do that much to really help them out. So very little control, rooted in kind of this colonial history. Maybe kind of one reason why that protection isn't found in Puerto Rico. One of the strongest predictors of adolescence success is poverty. Growing up poor adversely affects adolescents' brain development. The negative impact of growing up in a poor home on brain development has an especially negative effect on school achievement. As family income increases, noticeable changes in brain function occur. As income inequality has increased, so has rates of depression in higher class and poor. Perceiving yourself as poor is also a predictor of negative outcomes. Poverty marks the transition to adulthood, or makes the transition to adulthood more difficult for all teenagers. Minority teenagers are more likely to grow up poor and therefore are more likely to have transition problems. Rural white poverty traditionally overlooked. High rates of social isolation, hopelessness, and drug addiction are commonly found in rural white poverty populations. That is, you live fast, die young. So kind of some big takeaways here is that you literally see changes in neurological activity depending on the class you're in. And it's not this genetic thing wherein poor people are inferior or whatever. You can see like, oh, they randomly got a good job, they're out of poverty, a family, for example. All of a sudden, kind of indicators of development increase in children that grew up in poverty. So you literally see like an increase, which is telling you, hey, either this person had a genetic mutation right at that exact moment that their parent got a good job and more dignity in their life, or class matters developmentally. This is an important environmental factor. Spoiler, it's the latter. And poverty makes development and transition difficult for a whole host of reasons. You can imagine graduating from high school. If you graduate from high school, you look around and like, okay, where do I work? There's really no jobs here. This neighborhood's really unstable. What is my future? Like, what can I do? And that kind of uncertainty, all alongside all kinds of other stressors going on in your life, economic stressors, social stressors, maybe family problems, relationship problems, all these things coming together to put these teens at huge risk. Then you combine racism combined with poverty and all these kind of other things, putting these people growing up in these communities, poor individuals, racial minorities who are also poor at the same time, at huge kind of risk. And also kind of really kind of traditionally understudied in psychology is rural white poverty, which has horrific developmental outcomes, very, very much at risk due to just underinvestment, like in labor, education, physical construction, all kinds of things. And this can create huge cases of social isolation, hopelessness, and drug addiction. You see a lot of opioid addiction concentrated in kind of these very kind of disinvested, almost like feeling completely hopeless, feeling like you have no control of your life. There's no future. There's nowhere to go. So like, I got to numb this pain kind of through literally a physical pain medication, opioid, and then you get opioid abuse. And kind of the whole kind of takeaway from this is live fast, die young. Like you look around you, what's the future? What can possibly change? I can't change anything about this by myself. There's no prospect for change. There's nothing around me. I'm going to probably die early. So I'm going to take more risk, which is then going to put me at greater a risk of kind of like negative things happening to me, which then can cascade. And all of a sudden, boom, you're arrested, you're lost access to federal benefits, you're in a rocky relationship, and they just compound. So kind of like the structure of poverty, placing people, surrounding people, encapsulating people in very risky situations, which is possible to get out of, but very, very, very difficult. Influence of neighborhood conditions. Poverty has become more concentrated in the past 40 years, with poor families clustering in economically and racially segregated communities. Studying this is tricky. It is difficult to separate neighborhood disadvantage and family disadvantage from quote-unquote naturally, that's because they quote-unquote naturally covary. Correlations is the stats jargon. I'll break that momentarily. Relocating poor families to more affluent neighborhoods sometimes negatively affects adolescents' behaviors. Its mixed findings is sometimes good, bad, or no change. They may encounter more discrimination, that is, people who move to more affluent neighborhoods. Moving to a more affluent community may result in actually having less access to community resources, may compare their life circumstances to others. Material living circumstances improved by subject social status declined. Could have gendered effects. Parents in poor neighborhoods tend to monitor children more closely. So kind of throughout time, poverty has been concentrated. So basically there are areas in the country of extreme poverty that everybody doesn't want to look at. They design roads that go around them. They don't look at them in the streets, whatever. There's clusters of areas of homelessness that people, again, look away from. So at the kind of the point here is that through time, that poverty, people who growing up in poverty or live in poverty are kind of clumped together in specific, basically, poverty zones, and then kind of just like ignored by broader society. And thus kind of that clustering of putting everybody together is basically combining a shit ton of like risk factors together. So it's very, very difficult to kind of determine, okay, what aspect of this kind of living in poverty is causing a specific negative developmental outcome. Because growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood, a neighborhood that's high in poverty, you're going to have more likely to have like rocky social relationships, rocky family relationships, rocky, obviously, income. So all those things basically are naturally they are naturally correlated within the world. Again, we don't exist in a vacuum. If you live in a poor neighborhood, you're more likely to be exposed to violence, more likely to have rockier relationships with peers, friends, family, all these things coming together. So it's kind of difficult to find like a community that's like, oh, they're super poor, but also they have like elite, strong family units. There's no other issues going on in their life but the fact that they live in poverty. It doesn't work like that. These things are usually natural. They are naturally covary. They are naturally correlated. If you experience one, you're highly likely to experience another. Now, some kind of policies have looked at, again, very small policies, relocating poor families to more affluent neighborhoods, and it's kind of hit and miss. Sometimes they encounter more discrimination, which can be harmful to development. Also, you can look, if you move to kind of a more affluent neighborhood, maybe you look at the mansions all around you and you're like, damn, I am really, really poor. Versus before, you're basically living around people who are more or less the same kind of class as you. Thus, you don't really have kind of a social comparison to make. You don't get to see, you know it abstractly, but seeing it yourself in person, seeing the wealth of someone else, and then looking at your life, that can have, that real life observation, from going from abstract to specific observation, can have a negative impact on someone. So although your life circumstances may improve, your kind of like sense of social status can decline. Your sense of like dignity as a human being can decline. Also, affluent neighborhoods may have less kind of public resources because they're affluent. Maybe they're at a country club instead, or maybe they're in their big ass house instead. But maybe also at the same time, because of that, being invested in kind of like public goods, which may be more common in a poorer neighborhood. So some kind of combination of access to private kind of resources, while at the same time a decrease in kind of public resources, like YMCA or whatever, a basketball hoop or a library or whatever else is community-based. Library is like the most common one, rec and library kind of things. Also, just living in kind of a better community, like suburbs or whatever, doesn't mean you're magically going to be great. Like, we all understand that a lot of suburban children go unmonitored. They also partake in, like, drug activities. They police just don't kind of regulate theirs to the same extent that people do in the police do in poor neighborhoods. So kind of maybe an under-monitoring children in the suburbs. So you have a kid who grew up in poverty, kind of still a little developmentally at risk, now interacting in the suburbs with less monitoring, less structure, maybe more discrimination. That combination kind of actually placing them maybe more at risk, or maybe no change. But again, some studies have found it to be positive. But it's far from like a universal truth of positivity. Adolescents growing up in poor urban communities are more likely to be sexually active at an earlier age, bear children as teenagers, become involved in criminal activities, and achieve less in or drop out of high school. Findings are typically replicated in rural poor communities. Possible lower levels of hope contributes to loss of hope by engaging in risky activities. Yes, I did edit that. Even among adolescents already in legal problems, those who have higher expectations for future are less likely to reoffend. Adolescents developing in poor urban communities are more likely than their peers in equally poor neighborhoods, but better neighborhoods to be, or sorry, I should say, let me just reread that. Adolescents developing in poor urban communities are more likely than their peers in equally poor households, but better neighborhoods to be teen parents, become involved in crime, and drop out of high school. So these are just some risk factors associated with growing up in urban communities, and they're frankly replicated in rural communities as well. Just higher levels of sexual activity, more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to be involved in crime, which again can kind of begin a kind of cascading effect. But not only that, kind of a future hope for people who engage in risky activities, or adolescents who engage in risky activities, is meaningful. So if you, for example, got caught up in the criminal justice system as an adolescent, but you still have hope for the future, like, hey, maybe I'm gonna be, I don't know, some kind of, I'll enroll in college and then I'll get out of here and maybe come back and reinvest in the community or whatever, something along those lines. But that level of hope for a future is predictive of more positive outcomes, even if these adolescents are already involved in legal problems. Versus, and this is kind of straightforward, you look around, you're like, well, this is kind of hopeless, so who cares? Like, what's the point of even trying? I'm just going to survive. I'm living day by day. Again, live fast, die young. And basically the last finding is stating that poor adolescents who grew up in poor urban communities are at higher risk than adolescents who grew up in similar household income levels, but in better neighborhoods, to become involved in crime and drop out of school, which maybe suggests that, and really reflection of, that it's really not just the household, but also kind of the community contains a whole set of risk factors or protective factors that impact child development. There are three different mechanisms that have been suggested as ways that neighborhood conditions affect the behavior and development of adolescents. Collective efficacy, or I should say efficacy, the extent to which neighbors trust each other, share common values, and count on each other to monitor the activities of youth in the community. And low collective efficacy, or efficacy, keep messing up that word, communities and low collective efficacy communities, easier for antisocial peer groups to develop and influence adolescent behaviors. Rates of teen pregnancy, school failure, mental health problems, and antisocial behaviors are all higher in neighborhoods that have low levels of collective efficacy. You can conceptualize it like a contagion spreading across people. Living in a neighborhood high in collective efficacy is protective for the parents, children, and community children. Across cultures, high efficacy encourages adolescents to form deeper emotional bonds with communities, thus making them feel less lonely and isolated and safer. So basically the idea here is that this collective efficacy, the higher you are, the more your neighbors trust each other, the more you believe that you share common values, the more likely you are to participate in kind of collective neighborhood activities. Thus, the youth can be involved in kind of like neighborhood activities. You're monitored by other parents. You have a relationship with the community, other parents. You have a sense of belonging and a purpose, kind of and a set of mentors throughout your life. Versus kind of lower levels of efficacy, wherein you don't trust each other. You don't feel like you have share the same values. You're not monitoring each other's children. People are just kind of running wild. And in that absence, in that vacuum, what can develop are kind of groups of antisocial peers influencing each other. So basically, in the absence of monitoring and in the presence of basically just social distrust around you, kind of that acting kind of like a contagion, like a social contagion, wherein antisocial behavior is, again, kind of clustered in these groups of antisocial peers, and then they kind of spread outward, wherein now you have higher rates of kind of teen pregnancy, school failure, all those kind of things associated with antisocial peers, spreading across kind of your community. Wherein even in kind of poorer neighborhoods, that higher level of efficacy protects against some of those most dangerous influences or those most risky environmental factors associated with kind of poverty or kind of like an unstable neighborhood. Because again, having that trust, that camaraderie, that shared sense of community creates kind of a deeper bond between or strengthens the social bond between the adolescent and their parents, but also other kind of elders within the community, other institutions in the community. Thus, they're less alone, they have more guidance, they're less isolated, and they're safer. So thus, they don't feel like they have to be like on edge at all times in order to survive in their immediate surroundings. The second mechanism is stress. Stressors associated with poverty undermine the quality of people's relationships. Across all ethnic groups, poverty is associated with harsh, inconsistent, and punitive parenting. These factors in turn are linked to adolescent misbehavior. Adolescents from poor neighborhoods are more likely to be exposed to chronic community violence, which increases the risk of behavioral, emotional, and psychological problems. Adolescents exposed to violence are more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening, have poor emotional regulation, become desensitized to violence, and have numerous physical and mental health problems. Adolescents exposed to violence are more likely to engage in violence, think about suicide, attempt suicide, report depression, develop PTSD, feel hopelessness, and engage in drug abuse. Being the victim of violence is even a stronger predictor of witnessing violence. Factors that help protect against the harmful effects of neighborhood stressors include positive family relationships, supportive peer relationships, extracurricular involvement, and specific public policies. So kind of a big impact of stressors is just that you are on edge all the time. You thus have kind of like more rockier relationships. You're going to be, your parents, more likely to be depressed, have some kind of psychological disorder, have high rates of depression, feel hopeless, have PTSD, be suicidal. All these kind of things make your relationship with your parents and your family more rocky. And thus that kind of foundation, that social kind of base, being rocky puts you at greater risk of all kinds of antisocial behaviors. But also, this is going on at a community level. Everybody's stressed out. You're interacting with people around you who are kind of like on edge and thus kind of a little snippy at times. And this can be, again, can contribute to higher rates of violence, exposure to violence or abuse. And seeing that violence in your community puts children at more risk of committing violence in the future, becoming desensitized to violence, and also developing their own psychological disorders such as PTSD, depression, and engaging in drug abuse. And as stated, being a victim of violence puts you even at a greater risk. And some factors that help reduce the impact of neighborhood stressors, again, positive family relationships, supportive peer relationships, being kind of involved in community and public policy. So like theoretically decreasing the rates of poverty. Poverty is not just this magical thing that exists. For example, like minimum wage did not exist 100 years ago. The existence of minimum wage took people out of poverty. Social Security took a hell of a lot of people, or a lot of older adults, out of poverty. Those kind of things can impact rates of stress and rates of poverty in a person's life. And finally, limited access to resources. Poor neighborhoods have poorer quality schools, medical care, transportation, job opportunities, and parks. Adolescents who live in neighborhoods with higher quality schools are less likely to be involved in antisocial behavior. In neighborhoods with higher levels of resources and greater feelings of cohesion, adults' beliefs of teenagers tend to be more favorable. So kind of the idea here is that resources matter. These, again, all these are going to be interrelated, but you're going to have better medical care, better transportation, better sidewalks, better job opportunities, public resources, libraries. All these things are more likely to to exist in areas of high wealth, and less likely to exist in poor neighborhoods. And as kind of stated, the more, or I should say, the more resources present in a community generally fosters greater cohesion between teenagers, or at least teenagers to be viewed as kind of less negatively by adults in that community. So kind of this is an example of how macro effect influences impact our quote-unquote individual personal beliefs. So you literally see, on average, people in higher resource communities having more positive kind of feelings towards teenagers. Again, on average. But this kind of makes sense because, again, you're going to, in poor, more rocky, super stressed out neighborhoods, more likely for antisocial peers or adolescents to develop. Thus, you're more likely to interact with an antisocial peer, which is not a great time. Thus, in the absence of that, you're going to have a higher favorability or favorable feelings towards adolescents in a higher quality or richer, more plentiful resourced community. And with that said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much. Bye.